When you imagine medieval life, you might picture knights in armor, castles looming over villages, or peasants tilling muddy fields. But if you step inside the walls of an ordinary home, the most personal and telling piece of furniture is not the grand table in the hall, but the bed. For us, the bed is a place of rest, often clean and carefully prepared. But for people in the Middle Ages, the bed was a complicated landscape of wood, straw, cloth, and crawling things that shared a night. Beds were valuable objects. In fact, owning a proper bed was a mark of wealth. For peasants, sleep might have meant nothing more than a pile of straw on the floor, with a thin blanket, if that. But as you move up the social ladder, beds became more elaborate. Wooden frames with rope lattices stretched across, topped with stuffed mattresses. And yet, despite all the care and carpentry, the bed was still a hive of uninvited guests. Most medieval mattresses began with straw. Straw was plentiful, cheap, and easy to replace, at least in theory. A peasant family might bundle stuffs together tightly, stuffing them into a coarse linen sack to form what was known as a palliasse. At first, it would have been springy and firm, but straw breaks down quickly. After weeks of use, the stalks flatten, crumble, and begin to rot. In that rotting straw came moisture, warmth, and hiding places, perfect for insects and vermin. Fleas thrived in the folds. Lice settled in and multiplied. Bed bugs, already ancient companions of humanity, found dark crevices to live in. If you were wealthy, you might avoid straw by upgrading to feathers or wool. Feather beds, known as feather ticks, were softer and held their shape longer. Yet they, too, harbor problems. The small shafts of feathers, difficult to remove entirely, could poke through fabric and irritate skin, and the feathers themselves attracted mites. Wool stuffing, on the other hand, resisted vermin slightly better but was expensive. A single bed could consume the wool of several sheep. Either way, the mattress was not a place of perfect comfort. It was a compromise between softness and survival. The wooden frame of a medieval bed often relied on a network of ropes woven back and forth, forming a grid to hold a mattress above the ground. The phrase "sleep tight" is often said to come from tightening these ropes so the bed would not sag. Every few weeks, a servant or family member would adjust them, pulling each rope taut and tying off again. Yet even this solution introduced new problems. The ropes themselves gathered dust and moisture, and insects could crawl freely along them. If the mattress sagged in the middle, it became a trap for pests and sweat alike. The ropes also meant the bed frame had to be strong and carefully built. Oak was common for wealthier families, though pine and beech were used when cost was an issue. In many households, the bed was the most valuable piece of furniture. In wills and inventories, beds are listed right alongside land and tools. A bed was not just a place to sleep, it was property worth passing down. The medieval bed was rarely a private place. A whole family might sleep in one bed, parents, children, even servants on occasion. Heat was precious, and sharing a mattress meant warmth survived the night. But with more bodies came more lice, more fleas, and more dirt carried in from fields and streets. In inns or poorhouses, strangers sometimes shared beds. A traveler could find himself lying next to someone he had never met before, separated only by a thin blanket. This practice, called double lodging, was notorious for spreading vermin and disease. Imagine falling asleep beside a stranger, only to wake scratching at bites in the morning light. Even kings were not entirely safe. While royalty slept in ornate beds with heavy curtains and embroidered coverings, the problem of bugs could not be completely banished. Curtains might keep draft away, but they also trapped air, moisture, and the smell of unwashed bodies. The finer the cloth, the more easily it became a nest for lice. How often were beds cleaned? The answer depends on wealth and diligence. Straw mattresses were meant to be replaced, sometimes twice a year, sometimes only once. But replacing them required cutting, bundling, and hauling new straw, a task not done lightly. Feather and wool mattresses could not simply be discarded. Instead, they were beaten, aired, and occasionally restuffed. Beating a mattress meant dragging it outside, hanging it on a frame or over a line, and striking it with sticks to shake out dust and insects. Sheets, if they existed, were washed with lye soap or boiled in large pots. But soap was harsh, and fabric wore out quickly. A family might wash sheets only a few times a year. More often, they were simply shaken out and reused. The blankets, made of wool or heavy cloth, might go years without a proper cleaning. In winter, beds became heavy, layered caves of fabric, warm but filled with hidden life. To sleep in a medieval bed was to accept the company of creatures you could not see in the dark. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were only the beginning. Mice sometimes found their way into straw mattresses, gnawing and nesting in the warmth. Spiders spun webs beneath the wooden frames. Even cats and dogs were sometimes invited to sleep on the bed, not out of affection but out of necessity. Cats helped keep mice away, and dogs provided warmth. But with animals came fleas of their own. The scratching, biting, and crawling sensations were normal to people then. They lived with vermin as an unavoidable part of life. Complaints existed, certainly, but there was no expectation of true relief. To be bitten in bed was as ordinary as waking to a cold morning or hearing the church bells toll. Only much later, with advances in cleaning, insect control, and better construction, did the idea of a truly clean bed take hold. For those who could afford them, bed curtains were an essential part of sleeping. They shielded sleepers from drafts, muffled sounds, and gave a sense of privacy in a crowded household. But they also created another layer where pests could hide. The heavy fabrics absorbed smoke from fires, sweat from bodies, and dust from the air. To step inside such a curtained bed was to enter a small, enclosed world, heavy with scent and the faint scratching of life beneath the mattress. The medieval bed, then, was more than a piece of furniture. It was a stage where wealth, survival, and discomfort played out together. Even the richest could not escape the reality of bugs, while the poor accepted straw and dirt as part of nightly rest. The act of lying down to sleep was not the promise of peace, but the beginning of another small battle, one fought in silence against vermin that had lived with humans for centuries. And yet, knowing all this, we might wonder, how did people tolerate such discomfort night after night? And what remedies, however small, did they turn to in hopes of relief? If Section 1 showed you the landscape of the medieval bed, Section 2 brings you into the realm of remedies and resistance. People did not simply surrender to fleas, lice, and bedbugs. They scratched, schemed, and prayed their way toward relief. What emerges is not just a tale of pests, but a mirror of medieval survival itself. Improvisation, tradition, and faith entwined. One of the most common strategies against bed vermin was the use of herbs. Medieval households kept bundles of dried plants not only for cooking and medicine, but also for warding off insects. Lavender, wormwood, pennyroyal, and mint were among the favorites. These herbs could be scattered into bedding, sewn into small cloth bags, or even burned to fumigate a room. Lavender, in particular, was treasured for its fragrance. A sprig tucked into a mattress sack or pinned to a pillow was thought to repel lice and fleas. Wormwood, with its bitter smell, was another go-to plant. Pennyroyal, though toxic if ingested, was used as a deterrent against crawling insects. People might mix crushed herbs with vinegar, dabbing the solution onto sheets or around the bed frame. The idea was not always about killing bugs, but about making the space less inviting. Herbs gave the illusion of control, of a cleaner, more managed bed, even if the results were temporary. They also masked the odors of sweat, smoke, and decay that otherwise filled medieval homes. Another method was fumigation. In winter, when smoke from the hearth already lingered in rafters, some families deliberately exposed bedding to smoke. Hanging blankets and mattresses near the fire, or placing herbs on embers to release their fumes, was thought to drive pests away. Smoke had the advantage of reaching into crevices where insects hid. A mattress beaten with sticks outside, then held over a smoking brazier, might come back inside smelling strong, but temporarily cleaner. The smell of burned rosemary or juniper was a common household note, part ritual, part hygiene. Yet fire was a danger in itself. Straw bedding was flammable, and houses of timber and thatch could go up in minutes. The balance between smoke's cleansing power and its risk was delicate, and not every attempt ended well. For many households, the daily routine of managing the bed became a form of ritual. In wealthier homes, servants were tasked with turning mattresses, shaking sheets, and beating blankets. In humbler cottages, family members did the same work with fewer tools. Bedding might be dragged into the yard, flung over a fence or bush, and struck repeatedly with wooden paddles. The sound of a mattress being beaten was a familiar one in villages, a dull thudding that signaled not anger, but necessity. Curtains, too, needed tending. They collected dust and fleas, so they were sometimes brushed or even beaten like clothing. Some homes kept bed curtains tied back during the day to air them, though in cold weather, drafts discouraged this. The very act of preparing the bed each evening, straightening ropes, arranging blankets, tucking herbs into folds, was a miniature battle against discomfort. Where herbs and smoke were not enough, people turned to mixtures of oils, fats, and even poisons. Vinegar was a favorite, cheap, accessible, and strong-smelling. Some households rubbed vinegar on bed frames or sprinkled it onto straw. Animal fats mixed with herbs could be smeared onto wood, creating a greasy barrier against crawling bugs. Mercury and arsenic occasionally appear in medical recipes for lice and fleas, though these were dangerous and expensive. More often, people relied on garlic, onions, or pitch. The smell was thought to drive insects away, though it must have made the bed itself less pleasant. Still, for those desperate to escape biting in the night, even foul odors were preferable to endless scratching. Of course, the problem was not confined to bed. Lice lived in clothing and hair, traveled with people wherever they went. In many households, children were combed regularly with fine-toothed wooden or metal combs, a slow and patient task. These combs are often found in archaeological digs, their teeth worn down from years of use. Boiling clothes was one way to kill lice, but it was labor-intensive and required fuel that many families could not spare. Instead, clothes were brushed, beaten, or frozen in winter air. Some people even shaved their heads to escape lice infestations, especially in monasteries, where tonsure kept hair short. Bed bugs, by contrast, were more elusive. They lived in cracks of furniture, in walls, and under floors. Once a house had them, they were nearly impossible to remove. Remedies existed, but most people accepted that they were part of life. When herbs and labor failed, people turned to faith. Prayers against vermin were not uncommon, invoking saints to protect sleepers from crawling things of the night. Holy water sprinkled on bedding was believed to purify it. Amulets and charms, sometimes sewn into pillows, carried protective words or symbols. One curious tradition involved placing a piece of bread blessed at Easter inside a bed to ward off pests. Another recommended hanging a cross or religious token above the bed, not only for spiritual comfort, but also as a form of magical protection. Whether these worked or not, they offered reassurance in a world where certainty was rare. Imagine entering a medieval bedroom after such efforts. The bed smells of smoke, herbs, vinegar, and sweat. The curtains hang heavy. The straw crunches faintly beneath the sheets, and perhaps a dog curls at the foot of the mattress. You lie down, still scratching at bites, but comforted by the thought that at least some measures have been taken. In the morning, you may wake to find fleas once again, but the effort itself, the beating, the herbs, the prayers, was its own kind of victory. The persistence of these remedies reveals something about medieval life. It was never about eliminating discomfort, only about managing it. People accepted vermin as a constant, like cold winters or poor harvests. The goal was not perfection, but survival with dignity. And yet, we are left to wonder, when did people finally begin to dream of beds truly free of pests, and what changes in society made that dream possible? For centuries, people lived with the expectation that their beds would crawl. To lie down at night was not an escape from the world's irritations, but an extension of them. Yet, history is nothing if not a record of slow changes, often invisible until they are complete. The story of the bed is one of those transformations. From straw and vermin to springs and cotton, from scratching the dark to sinking into silence. The first shift came not from grand inventions, but from cloth. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, linen became more widely available. Unlike wool, linen sheets could be washed more easily, and they wore differently against the skin. The spread of linen meant that beds could be layered, a coarse straw mattress on the bottom, but with cleaner, replaceable sheets above. For wealthier households, this created a new sense of hygiene and comfort. Laundry practices, too, evolved. Soap improved, water heating became more practical in some homes, and laundresses, often women who specialized in the grueling work of washing fabrics, kept sheets whiter and fresher. Still, the effort was immense. A single wash day meant hauling water, boiling linens, scrubbing with ash or lye, and beating cloth against rocks or paddles. Few households managed it often, but the very idea that bedding could be cleaned regularly was a quiet revolution. As trade networks expanded, so did materials for bedding. Cotton, imported at first in small amounts, offered a lighter alternative to wool. In cities with active textile industries, cotton ticking began to cover mattresses, keeping pests more contained. Feathers remained popular among the wealthy, but the development of better woven fabric meant fewer feathers escaped and fewer insects slipped inside. By the 17th century, urban workshops produced standardized bed furnishings. Mattresses, bolsters, and pillows could be bought, not just handmade at home. For many families, this was a first step toward uniformity. A bed was no longer a purely personal improvisation, but a product of craft and trade. Meanwhile, the form of the bed itself changed. What began as simple curtains became elaborate canopies. In castles and manor houses, four-poster beds enclosed sleepers in private chambers within chambers. These canopies were status symbols, embroidered and fringed, but they also reflected an ongoing struggle with pests. Heavy curtains still trapped insects, yet they also offered protection from drafts and prying eyes. Servants might sleep on pallets nearby, but the lord or lady within the canopy enjoyed a measure of separation. Even in more modest homes, wooden frames grew sturdier. Beds were raised higher from the ground, making it harder for vermin and cold air to reach sleepers. Rope support improved and joinery became tighter, leaving fewer cracks for bedbugs to hide in. These were small improvements, but they mattered. The real turning point came with the 18th and 19th centuries, when industry reshaped domestic life. Cotton became abundant and affordable. Machine-woven fabrics replaced hand-spun ones, making sheets, ticking, and blankets more uniform. Iron bed frames began to replace wood, a change with enormous consequences. Iron, unlike oak or pine, offered no cracks for bedbugs to nest in. Springs were introduced in the 19th century, giving mattresses a resilience straw could never match. Stuffing improved as well. Horsehair, new forms of processed wool, and layered cotton batting created mattresses that resisted flattening and rotting. Suddenly, the expectation of a cleaner, longer-lasting bed was within reach of the middle class. Alongside these material changes came new cultural attitudes toward cleanliness. The Enlightenment's focus on health in the body encouraged practices of regular washing, airing, and disinfecting. In urban centers, medical advice circulated about how often bedding should be laundered, how rooms should be ventilated, and why pests carry disease. The rise of germ theory in the 19th century transformed these practices further. No longer was a flea bite merely an irritation. It was understood as a vector of illness. This scientific shift put pressure on families, inns, and hospitals alike to maintain higher standards of bedding hygiene. To sleep in filth was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. By the dawn of the 20th century, the bed had been remade. It was no longer a nest of straw replaced twice a year, but a structured, layered, cleaner refuge. Iron frames, factory-made mattresses, and washable sheets combined to create the expectation we still carry today, that the bed is not only a necessity but also a comfort. Yet even then, the battle against pests did not entirely end. Bed bugs, adaptable as ever, survive into modern apartments and hotels. Fleas still travel with pets. Lice continue to haunt schools and barracks. The difference was that now, these were considered intrusions, not inevitabilities. What had once been a normal part of life was reclassified as a problem to be solved. To look back on the medieval bed is to see a world where discomfort was expected, and where survival meant constant negotiation with the crawling companions of the night. Yet it is also to trace the slow growth of human expectations. What was once tolerated became resented, and what was once impossible became necessary. The bed, in its long history, moved from a stage of endurance to a symbol of rest, from straw sacks and scratching to springs and silence. And so, one question lingers. If even something as ordinary as a bed could evolve so dramatically, what other parts of daily life that we now take for granted are still waiting for their quiet revolutions? When you imagine ancient Rome, you might see marble temples, bustling forums, and soldiers marching in perfect order. But history, when stripped of its statues and stories, also has a smell. Rome was not the pristine city of imagination. It was a place where thousands of people, animals, and trades converged daily in tight quarters, and the air reflected it. To walk through the Roman streets was to enter a world of odors, some familiar, many overwhelming, and most long forgotten. Rome, at its height, was a city of over 1 million people. That number alone was staggering in the ancient world, and it came with consequences. Every breath you took in a Roman street carried the weight of human presence. People pressed shoulder to shoulder in narrow lanes. They shouted, bargained, and argued, exhaling into air that never fully cleared. In a time before modern sanitation, the sheer density of human bodies meant the streets were thick with the smell of sweat, unwashed clothes, and breath warmed by wine and garlic. Baths existed, of course, and Romans prided themselves on cleanliness, but not everyone could afford daily access. Even those who bathed still returned to streets where sweat quickly returned. Perfumes, popular among the wealthy, mixed with odors rather than erasing them. A man splashing himself with oil and scraping it off at the baths might walk past a butcher's stall and carry home the mingled smells of both. The streets of Rome were not just filled with people. Animals, both wild and domestic, shared the space. Horses pulled carts, mules hauled goods, pigs rooted along alleys, and dogs wandered freely. Each left its mark, droppings, hair, and the musk of their bodies. Pigs, in particular, were notorious for roaming streets, rooting through refuse piles, and adding their grunts and stench to the daily scene. Cattle sometimes entered the city for slaughter or festivals. Chickens clucked in courtyards and sometimes spilled into lanes. Even sacred geese were kept within temple grounds. Every hoofbeat and squawk came with a smell, and every street corner became a place where waste accumulated. Without modern waste collection, animal dung piled up until rain or human effort washed it away, into gutters or into the Tiber. The Romans were organized in many ways, but garbage collection was not the city's pride. Household waste, food scraps, broken pottery, ashes, was often tossed into the street or piled against walls. Some alleys became narrow dumps with layers of debris underfoot. Children played in them, dogs rooted through them, and beggars searched for anything of value. Chamber pots added to the problem. Many homes lacked latrines, especially in crowded insulae, the tall apartment blocks where most Romans lived. Instead, waste was carried in pots and emptied into the street below, often without warning. Imagine walking through a bustling Roman market, only to feel the sudden splash of liquid descending from a window above. To shout, "Look out below," was a courtesy not always granted. Open sewers existed, and larger streets had stone channels running along their sides. These carried rainwater, waste, and anything else dumped into them toward the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer. Yet the system, while impressive, was easily overwhelmed. In dry weather, filth baked in the sun. In wet weather, it flowed openly. Either way, the smell was inescapable. Markets were the heart of Roman life, and their smells were unforgettable. Butchers carved animals in open stalls, blood pooling on the ground, hides drying nearby. Fishmongers shouted over their wares as the odor of salted and fresh fish mingled with river mud. Bakers filled the air with the warm, tempting smell of bread, but even that was layered over smoke and sweat. Spices, imported from distant lands, added complexity. Cinnamon, pepper, and cumin cutting to the more common odors. Wine sellers spilled sour drink onto cobblestones. Olive oil merchants leaked sticky trails from amphorae. Honey cakes, incense from temples, roasting meats, all were there, but none erased the stench of rotting vegetables discarded behind stalls or rats scurrying through piles of refuse. The Roman market was not a place of clean separation. Sweet and foul, savory and rotten, all competed in the same narrow streets. The Tiber River, winding through the city, was both lifeline and hazard. Its waters carried goods, washed waste, and served as a public bath for some. But it also carried smells. In summer heat, when the river ran low, The stench of stagnant water and refuse grew heavy. Dead animals sometimes floated downstream, mingling with waste dumped directly into the current. For those who lived near the riverbanks, the smell was constant. Fishermen hauled in catches tainted with the same waters. Children played on its shores, their game set against a backdrop of rot and mud. The Tiber was Rome's vein of life, but also a vein of smell, connecting every part of the city in a shared odor. Taken together, the Roman streets were a symphony of scents: sweat and garlic, dung and incense, bread and blood, smoke and river mud. For Romans, it was simply normal. To walk to the Forum was to breathe all of Rome at once. To meet a friend in the market was to stand amid smells both comforting and revolting. We imagined the grandeur of marble temples, but the reality was lived in the nose. The smell of Rome was the smell of its people, its animals, its markets, its waste. It was not the distant odor of history, but the immediate presence of life lived close together, without escape. Today, when we visit ruins, we see only the silent stones. The air is clean, the forum's quiet. But if you could step back in time, your first impression would not be sight. It would be smell. To live in Rome was to accept that the air itself carried the city. And so, we are left to wonder, if the smell of Rome was so constant and overwhelming, how did its people describe it, endure it, or even celebrate in their writings and daily rituals? If the first part of this story walked us through the physical streets of Rome, the second asks us to step inside Roman minds. Because smell, as much as sight or sound, shapes how people think of their world. The Romans were no different. They complained about odors, joked about them, judged each other through them, and even built small rituals around them. In a city of over 1 million, the air was not just something to breathe. It was something to interpret. Roman writers often linked smell to morality. The Stoics, who sought a life of moderation and virtue, sometimes used stench as a metaphor for corruption. A foul odor was like a bad deed, unpleasant, unavoidable, and a sign of decay. Seneca, the philosopher and tutor to Nero, commented on the smells of Rome in his letters. To him, the crowded baths reeked of oil, sweat, and perfumes, a blend that offended his sense of purity. He treated these odors as distractions from the calm of the mind. Other philosophers were more practical. Some suggested that odors, even unpleasant ones, kept the body alert or signaled dangers. The smell of smoke meant fire. The smell of rot meant disease. In this way, foul smells were not just nuisances but warnings. The city's stench was a constant reminder of life's fragility. Poets, never missing a chance to mock daily life, often turned to smell as material. Juvenal, the satirist, wrote bitterly of Rome's streets, where the press of bodies and the flow of waste turned the city into an assault on the senses. Martial, another sharp-tongued poet, mocked those who tried to cover their odors with too much perfume, suggesting that the attempt was worse than the problem. Perfume, in fact, was a double-edged sword in Roman culture. Too little, and you smelled of sweat and dirt. Too much, and you smelled of vanity and excess. Martial jokes that a man drowning himself in exotic scents might as well carry the entire perfumer's shop on his back. The ideal was balance. But balance was hard to achieve in streets where sewage and garlic dominated the air. Beyond poets and philosophers, ordinary Romans left traces of their attitudes in graffiti, letters, and casual remarks. In Pompeii, graffiti warned passers-by of foul spots. Complaints about neighbors waste-throwing appear in preserved tablets. Even Cicero, the famous orator, once wrote disdainfully of a political opponent, mocking him for the stench of his habits. To complain about smell was to mark social boundaries. The wealthy could afford to live uphill, away from the Tiber's stink, while the poor crowded into tenements near markets and drains. To accuse someone of smelling bad was not just a personal insult. It was a statement about their class, their hygiene, and their place in society. Not all Roman smells were foul. Temples filled the air with incense, burned as offerings to gods. Myrrh, frankincense, and resin carried sacred meanings. Their sweetness contrasted with the streets outside, a reminder that the divine was marked by fragrance. In festivals, streets were sometimes strewn with flowers, a brief attempt to outshine the odors of everyday life. Yet even sacred smells could become controversial. Critics of foreign cults sometimes mocked the exotic stench of their incense. Smell was cultural, and to reject another group's odor was to reject their identity. For Romans, what smelled good was bound up with who belonged and who did not. Doctors, too, had their say. Roman medicine was rooted in humors and balance, and smell was thought to influence health. A foul odor could corrupt the body, spreading imbalance through the air. Good smells were seen as restorative. The physician Galen, influential for centuries, recommended strong aromas as treatments: rosemary for clarity, myrrh for purification, vinegar for cleansing. People carried sponges soaked in vinegar during plagues, holding them to their noses to ward off bad air or miasma. This belief, that disease spread through corrupted smells, would last well into the Middle Ages. To them, the stink of Rome was not just unpleasant, it was dangerous. Every waft of sewage or rot carried with it the suggestion of illness. Despite all these complaints and theories, one fact stands out: Romans lived with the smell. They joked, they complained, they philosophized, but they endured. To walk into Rome after weeks in the countryside must have been overwhelming, the city announcing itself in the air long before its walls appeared. Yet for those born in its alleys, the odor was normal, even invisible. What we would recoil from, they accepted as life. Smell, in ancient Rome, was not a neutral thing. It marked status. It shaped medicine. It flavored religion, and it filled poetry with biting jokes. The air was a constant reminder of where you were and who you were. And so we ask, if Romans thought so much about smell, what practical measures did they take, if any, to keep their streets, their homes, and their bodies more bearable amid the stench? The Romans were not ignorant of their city's odors. They lived among them daily, and while many accepted the stench as normal, there were always efforts, small and large, practical and symbolic, to keep the city at least somewhat bearable. If the streets reeked, Rome still prided itself on being more advanced than other places. In some ways it was, and in other ways, its efforts fell short, leaving the smell of empire to linger in every alley. The most famous Roman response to filth was the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome. Built originally in the 6th century BCE, it was expanded and maintained over the centuries. This massive channel carried waste and storm water into the Tiber River. For its time, it was an engineering marvel. Stone arches supported tunnels that snaked beneath the city, allowing water and refuse to flow away. But the system had limits. It served the central parts of the city well, particularly the Forum and wealthier districts. In poorer neighborhoods or in crowded insulae, chamber pots still spilled into the street. The cloaca was impressive, but it could not erase the smell entirely. Instead, it was like a great vein beneath the city, collecting the worst of Rome's odors and carrying them to the river, where the stench simply shifted downstream. The task of keeping streets clear fell partly to public slaves and contractors. The curator's cloacrum oversaw sewers, while other officials hired workers to sweep streets, remove debris, and cart off larger waste. Evidence suggests that in wealthier districts, carts came more often, while poorer alleys were neglected. Still, sweeping was constant work. Imagine pushing brooms against dust, dung, and rotting vegetables in a crowded lane where new refuse was thrown down every hour. Dogs, pigs, and beggars would scatter piles before they could be collected. For every load carried away, another was already forming. One of Rome's most famous contributions to daily hygiene was the public bathhouse. These vast complexes provided more than just a soak. They were centers of social life. To bathe meant not only washing sweat away, but also scraping oils, dust, and odors from the body. The baths gave Romans a way to fight the smell of themselves, if not the smell of the streets. For a small fee, even poorer citizens could enter, bathe, and leave feeling somewhat refreshed. Wealthy Romans bathed daily, layering oils and perfumes to keep themselves distinct from the stench outside. Yet the baths themselves developed their own odor: steam, wet stone, oil, and the sweat of thousands. Philosophers like Seneca complained of the racket and smell. But for most Romans, the baths were an oasis. Perfumes were both luxury and necessity. Imported oils from Arabia, India, and Egypt came in ornate glass bottles. A dab behind the ears or on the clothes was not just fashion. It was survival. To walk through Rome without perfume was to carry the street's smell home with you. Even the poor had access to cheaper scents. Sellers in the markets offered mixtures of herbs and local oils. Vinegar, as mentioned earlier, was sometimes splashed on the body as a kind of deodorant. The goal was never to erase Rome's smell entirely, but to build a personal shield against it. In households, families developed their own routines. Sweeping courtyards, sprinkling sand or ash on wet waste, burning incense, and keeping windows open when possible were all strategies. Wealthier homes might use bowls of herbs to freshen rooms, while poorer tenants relied on air and sunlight. Still, with Inslee housing hundreds of people, chamber pots, and cooking fires, odors clung. If you lived in such a block, your nose never truly escaped the city, even indoors. For all their efforts, the Romans never eliminated the smell. They controlled it in places, masked it with perfumes, and shifted it through sewers. But the odors persisted. Disease outbreaks still swept the city, fueled in part by waste and crowding. Complaints of foul smells continued through every century of the empire. Yet compared to many ancient cities, Rome was advanced. Its sewers, baths, and street cleaners set a precedent. Later European cities, centuries after Rome's fall, often lacked even these. The irony is that for all its stink, Rome may have been cleaner than much of what came after. The smell of Rome, then, was not just a problem. It was a defining feature. It shaped philosophy, medicine, and daily habits. It forced the city to build sewers and baths. And it reminded every citizen, from senator to slave, that living together in such numbers came with costs. And so we're left with a lingering thought. If Rome, with all its power, could never escape its own odor, what does that tell us about the hidden, everyday struggles of even the mightiest civilizations? When we look back at the 18th century, we often imagine powdered wigs, glittering salons, candlelit letters, or naval battles etched into history books. But history is mostly not battles or salons. It is long stretches of time lived quietly. The 18th century was no exception. In fact, what most people felt day after day was not the drama of revolutions or the noise of industry, but the steady, dull passage of hours. Boredom was everywhere. The question was how to fight it, or, more often, how to endure it. To begin, remember what did not exist. No radio, no television, no phones, no endless stream of printed novels stacked in cheap editions. Books were precious, expensive, and limited. A single volume might be read again and again, its pages worn thin by repetition. Newspapers existed, but outside cities, they arrived late and carried stale news. Most rural households had no regular reading material at all. Entertainment was largely homemade. A fiddle, a set of cards, a deck of riddles passed from one person to another. People had to invent their diversions from what was at hand, and most of what was at hand were chores. Work and leisure blurred. To embroider was both useful and distracting. To carve a wooden toy was both pastime and necessity. Boredom crept in during pauses. A farmer's day was long, but not constant labor. There were hours between chores, long evenings in winter when darkness came early, days when weather canceled work. In cities, apprentices sat waiting for their masters to return. Servants lingered between tasks. Clerks sat staring at ledgers until the candle guttered. Unlike today, people had little expectation that every moment should be filled. Waiting was part of life. Waiting for letters. Waiting for a cart. Waiting for news to travel across weeks of distance. Waiting became an invisible structure of life. Still, people searched for ways to make waiting bearable. Talking was perhaps the most universal cure for boredom. People spoke to neighbors over fences, to strangers at inns, to family around the fire. Stories were told and retold, often with little variation. A well-worn tale could survive for years in a household, passed from elder to child, repeated on long nights when nothing else stirred. Conversation was not just entertainment, but also performance. A witty remark, a sharp observation, or a local rumor could lift an evening. Letters from abroad were read aloud, bringing whole communities into a distant cousin's affairs. Silence, by contrast, was heavy. To sit, without words, risked letting boredom thicken like fog in a room. Cards were a near-universal pastime where they could be afforded. Simple games like whist, piquet, or faro occupied evenings. Dice rolled across tables. In taverns, betting filled the silence. turning boredom into a chance for loss or gain. In homes without such luxuries, games were made from scraps. Counting stones, string puzzles, guessing games. Children invented contests with sticks and hoops. Adults sometimes joined in, not out of childishness, but because even simple play was relief from monotony. Board games as we know them were scarce, but growing. Early versions of backgammon, checkers, and chess were played in parlors. Each game required a partner, which meant boredom itself was a communal experience. To fight it often meant joining with others, not retreating alone. Music filled gaps too. A household with a fiddle, flute, or harpsichord carried a weapon against silence. Singing was even more common. Songs at work, songs at table, songs before bed. Folk songs passed down generations gave people something to repeat when minds grew restless. Music was not about performance for strangers, but about soothing one's own hours. An apprentice might hum to himself while sweeping. A servant might sing softly while tending to firewood. A farmer might whistle as he walked behind his plow. In this sense, music was not entertainment in the modern sense. It was survival against tedium. So much of 18th century life was not about seeking excitement, but about managing the long hours when nothing happened. To embroider, to sing, to gossip, to play with dice, all was less about joy and more about staving off the heavy weight of empty time. And this leaves us wondering, what happened when these small distractions weren't enough, when boredom stretched too far and people sought larger, riskier ways to escape it? Boredom was not always mild. Sometimes it pressed hard, turning quiet evenings into restless nights and long winters into smoldering frustrations. When embroidery, song, and small games failed, people sought heavier weapons. The 18th century was full of such escapes, each one reflecting both the limits of the age and the cravings of human nature. The tavern was one of the most obvious refuges. For men in particular, it was a place where boredom dissolved into ale, gossip, and dice. Taverns dotted every town, village, and roadside. Inside, smoke hung thick, mugs clattered, and talk ran louder than the hours outside. Drinking was not simply recreation. It was rhythm. Ale and beer were safer than much of the water available, so mugs were raised not just for fun but for health. Yet the tavern became more than necessity. For apprentices, it was escape from a master's eye. For farmers, it was relief from long days of toil. For soldiers, it was the only entertainment between campaigns. But drinking also sharpened dangers. Quarrels spilled into fights. Debts piled up from wagers. Authorities complained that taverns bred idleness, crime, and rebellion. And still, they thrived because boredom was harder to fight without them. Where cards and dice were harmless in the home, in taverns and city parlors they grew sharper. Gambling became a cure for boredom that promised excitement, even at the risk of ruin. Men bet on horses, on cockfights, on dice rolls, even on trivial contests. In some cities, entire fortunes shifted hands on the throw of a cube. The poor gambled pennies. The rich gambled estates. Women joined in as well, sometimes at cards and salons, sometimes in private games behind shutters. What gambling offered was not just a thrill of winning, but the surge of change itself. In a world where life often plodded predictably from day to day, the sudden chance of reversal, riches gained, debts erased, was intoxicating. But gambling was a fire. It fed on boredom, but left scars. Many families recorded in parish books lost farms and homes to debts. Some gamblers turned to theft, others to flight. Authorities tried to regulate games, but regulation itself became part of the game, broken, evaded, mocked. Not every escape was formal. Sometimes boredom led simply to trouble. Youths in villages harassed travelers for sport, overturned carts, or pestered animals in fields. Apprentices in cities formed gangs, wandering streets after dark, shouting, brawling, breaking windows. In London, Mohawk gangs gained infamy for attacking passers-by, slitting clothes, or rolling drunks in barrels. Much of it was fueled not by hatred, but by restlessness. Petty crime often had the same root. A servant caught stealing food might not have been starving, only bored. Shoplifting was not always about hunger, but about testing boundaries. In small towns, where little changed, the act of breaking rules became a twisted form of diversion. For those with access, Books became another risky escape. Not risky in violence, but in thought. Novels were still a young form, and some moralists fretted about their effects. Women in particular were warned against becoming addicted to novels, as if stories themselves were dangerous distractions from duty. To sink into a long romance or an adventure tale was to leave behind the boredom of chores and gossip. Yet critics argued that novels filled minds with unrealistic desires, making ordinary life harder to endure. The debate itself shows how powerful the lure of books was. Where others drank or gambled, some read, hiding away by candlelight until wax burned low. Another outlet was found in gatherings. Churches filled Sundays, but revivals, fairs, and festivals dotted calendars with moments of release. For many, these were less about faith or trade than about breaking monotony. Fairs brought noise, color, and spectacle. Revivals brought song, movement, and emotion that shattered the long quiet of daily life. Crowds were never just entertainment. They were energy. People shouted together, sang together, rioted together. Boredom could turn to joy or to rage. In this sense, collective release was both cure and danger, soothing restlessness while also stoking unrest. When simple games and songs fell short, the 18th century turned to stronger cures: ale, dice, mischief, novels, crowds. Each carried risks, violence, ruin, temptation, rebellion, yet they reveal something important. Boredom was not just emptiness. It was a force. It pushed people toward movement, sometimes gentle, sometimes reckless. And it leaves us to wonder, what happened when boredom did not drive people to taverns or novels, but instead inspired new creations, discoveries, or revolutions that shaped the century itself? If boredom sometimes led to mischief and ruin, it also fueled invention. The 18th century, often remembered for revolutions in industry, was in fact a period where countless hours of empty time nudged people toward new pursuits. Boredom was not simply endured. It was transformed into creation. Tinkerers and craftsmen often turned spare hours into experimentation. A watchmaker waiting for parts might design a new escapement. A farmer idling during winter might construct new plows from scrap wood and iron. Many of the century's small inventions were not born in workshops funded by kings, but in barns and parlors where time hung heavy. James Watt, often credited with transforming the steam engine, was a man who hated wasted time. His long hours of tinkering with models came not only from ambition, but also from the simple fact that he had time to fill. Countless inventors, famous and forgotten, shared this same pattern. Boredom became a spark for curiosity. The 18th century also saw the rise of hobbies as a concept. Collecting coins, pressing plants, sketching landscapes. These were ways of filling idle hours with structure. Natural history, in particular, flourished from boredom. Gentlemen and women kept cabinets of curiosities, filling drawers with shells, insects, and stones. What might have begun as a way to pass time grew into a foundation for science itself. Botany, for example, became a fashionable pursuit for bored elites. Hours spent cataloging plants in gardens or fields gave rise to new classifications, some feeding directly into Linnaeus's grand system. What once seemed a small pastime became a pillar of modern biology. Boredom also pushed people toward the page. Diaries, letters, and commonplace books flourished. A young woman in a rural parsonage might fill pages with reflections on weather, neighbors, and her own thoughts, not because she had a grand plan, but because she had time. These writings, preserved in archives, now give us rich insight into daily life that official records never could. Even novels, once criticized, blossomed under boredom's pressure. Writers like Samuel Richardson and Jane Austen crafted works out of the rhythms of waiting, longing, and ordinary conversation. Their characters live in boredom, waiting for letters, waiting for suitors, waiting for fortune. In this sense, literature became both a product of boredom and a mirror of it. It may seem strange, but boredom also played a role in politics. Discontent is often born from monotony. Peasants who lived through long years of sameness were more sensitive to small disruptions. Soldiers idling in barracks grew restless, sometimes turning mutiny into action. Even revolutions had their roots in boredom, long-standing grievances simmering during years of waiting, suddenly boiling over when opportunity arose. The American Revolution, The French Revolution and smaller uprisings across Europe were not only product of ideology, but also of restlessness. Pamphlets, debates, and assemblies filled the empty hours of men who might otherwise have remained silent. Boredom, in this sense, was not passive, it was political fuel. The story of boredom in the 18th century is not simply one of despair. It is a reminder that empty hours are powerful. They can break people down, driving them to drink or gambling. But they can also build, giving time for invention, reflection, and change. The very rhythm of idleness shaped both the dangers and the brilliance of the century. Looking back, it is easy to see boredom as a curse. But in the 18th century, it was also a resource. Without it, many inventions, hobbies, and even revolutions might never have taken form. People endured it, played with it, misused it, and transformed it. And so, one question lingers. If boredom shaped the 18th century so profoundly, how much of our own modern creativity still depends on moments of emptiness, moments we now rush to fill with endless distractions? When we think of communication today, it is instant. A message leaves your hand and arrives across the world in seconds. But for most of history, messages had legs. In the 17th and 18th centuries, when Europe and its colonies stitched together their networks of posts, letters moved by horse. They did not gallop dramatically into town with trumpets blaring. Most of the time, they trudged, steady and uneventful. The life of a postal rider was defined less by adventure than by repetition. Yet without those long, dull rides, the very machinery of states and empires would have faltered. The backbone of the system was the horse. A rider could cover roughly 30 to 40 miles in a day, depending on the terrain. At set intervals, known as post stations, fresh horses waited. The rider dismounted, exchanged animals, and carried on. The system was designed for efficiency, but it was not glamorous. Horses sweated, stumbled, and stopped. Saddles rubbed raw. Dust-coated clothes, until every rider looked the same shade of gray. The rider himself was often of modest station, sometimes a soldier on assignment, sometimes a hired courier. He was not celebrated. At best, he was tolerated as a necessary part of the machinery of government. His task was clear: carry the packet from one station to the next, never losing it, never lingering. What did the rider carry? Not sacks overflowing with letters, but carefully wrapped bundles. Most private people could not afford frequent correspondence. Postage was costly. A single letter might represent weeks of wages for the poor. The bulk of the mail was official, government decrees, legal summonses, commercial contracts. To hold such papers was to hold the veins of bureaucracy in your hands. The packet was sealed and tied, sometimes with wax, sometimes with string. Losing it was unthinkable. Riders were fined, dismissed, even imprisoned if they failed. And yet, the packet was often small, unremarkable, no heavier than a loaf of bread, no more glamorous than a folded shirt. The true companion of the postal rider was not the letter, but the road. Miles of mud, dust, cobblestones, and ruts stretched ahead. In spring, rains turned roads to slush. In summer, dust rose thick enough to choke. In winter, ice cracked hooves and froze hands stiff against reins. Some countries, like France, invested heavily in their postal roads, flattening, paving, and marking them. England built turnpikes that cut travel times. Yet even the best roads grew rough after weeks of carts and storms. For a rider, the journey was endless sameness. Mile after mile of hedgerows, stone walls, and villages where nothing changed from one week to the next. At post stations, the rider paused, but only briefly. He handed off his weary horse, signed a log, and mounted a new one. Inns clustered near these stations, offering food and drink. Bread, ale, a bit of cheese. The rider ate quickly, knowing time was tracked. Some riders slept at inns if their route required it, but more often they pressed on, sleeping only when their leg of the journey was finished. Innkeepers knew the riders well. They were neither honored guests nor strangers. They were routine, a flash of leather boots, the smell of horse sweat, the clatter of hooves in the yard, and then gone again. Though often uneventful, the road had its dangers. Highwaymen haunted certain stretches, seeking purses and letters alike. A postal rider might be armed with a pistol or sword, but most carried little more than courage and routine. Weather, too, was an enemy. Flooded rivers swept away bridges. Snow closed passes. Riders sometimes perished, their packets found days later in frozen saddlebags. Still, for the majority, the danger was less dramatic. It was boredom, long hours of trotting hooves, aching backs, and minds dulled by endless scenery. To ride the post was to live in rhythm. Hoofbeats, miles, stations, repeat. The postal rider was not a hero, yet without him, courts stalled, armies starved for orders, merchants lost contracts. The long, uneventful march of letters tied nations together. And so we might ask, how did these riders, facing monotony and hardship, keep the system running smoothly, and what structures of discipline and routine supported their endless journeys? If the first part showed the rider on the road, the second reveals the system that kept him moving. Because the post was not simply one man on a horse. It was an entire network of discipline, schedules, and routine. Without this structure, the rider might have drifted, lingered, or failed. The dull reliability of the post was built on rules as strict as any army's. Postal riders worked under a clock that was not theirs. Each route had a timetable, calculated down to the hour. Riders were required to sign registers at post stations, confirming the exact time of arrival and departure. Delays, even by minutes, could result in fines. The packet itself was sacred. Riders swore oaths to protect it. Tampering with letters was not merely frowned upon, but treated as a crime against the crown or the state. In many countries, opening official posts was punishable by dismissal, whipping, or imprisonment. The rider carried words that were not his own, and his honor depended on returning them untouched. To give the system visibility, many postal riders wore uniforms or carried marks of office. In France, riders often wore coats with the emblem of the royal post. In England, the post horn, a curved brass instrument, was both a symbol and a tool, sounded when entering towns or approaching gates. The uniform gave the rider authority. At inns, he was served quickly. At toll gates, he passed without charge. Yet the uniform was also a burden. It marked him as a target for highwaymen, and it reminded him that he was never off duty until the packet was delivered. Riders were not wealthy men. Their pay was modest, often barely enough to maintain their horses and equipment. In some regions, they provided their own animals, a costly obligation that consumed much of their wage. Others rode state-owned horses from station to station. But even then, the job offered little comfort. For many, the position was temporary, a step between military service and another trade, or a means of survival in lean times. Yet the system relied on their reliability. A rider who abandoned his route or lost his packet faced not only dismissal, but public shame. In a world where reputation mattered, to fail in post was to be branded untrustworthy. The rider's day began early, often before dawn. He checked his horse, tightened saddle straps, and secured the packet against his body. Hours on the road followed, broken only by brief pauses at stations. Meals were short and plain, bread and ale, perhaps cold meat or cheese if the innkeeper had some. Conversations at stations were practical. Time of arrival, condition of roads, rumors of danger. Riders met one another briefly, exchanging nods and warnings, but rarely lingered. The rhythm of the road left little space for friendship. Each rider was part of a chain, each link essential but fleeting. Discipline was enforced not only by pay but by fear. Stories circulated of riders dismissed for lateness, fined for negligence, or flogged for losing the packet. These tales kept others cautious. The state depended on its post not being delayed by excuses of weather or weariness. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night was not a romantic boast, but a practical demand. Some riders died on the job. Their deaths were noted in ledgers with little ceremony, their routes reassigned. The system continued impersonal, as if the rider himself mattered less than the letter he carried. And yet, many riders took pride in their work. To deliver the post was to serve the state, to tie together distant towns, courts, and armies. Some rode to the satisfaction of arriving on time, horn sounding, packet safe. Their names were rarely remembered, but their reliability was. This sense of duty was quiet, uncelebrated, and often invisible. The rider was not a hero in the public eye, but he was a thin thread keeping a kingdom connected. His long rides, dull as they seemed, were the veins through which orders and news flowed. The discipline of the post reminds us that history is often carried not by grand gestures, but by strict routines. Letters that shaped wars and treaties depended on men who followed rules, mile after mile, day after day. And so we might ask, when the system strained, when wars, storms, or rebellions disrupted the post, how did riders adapt, and what extraordinary stories emerged from an occupation defined by monotony? Most days, the postal rider's life was routine, dust hooves, stations, and silence. But every so often, the rhythm shattered. A storm, a war, a thief on the road. These moments, rare though they were, exposed the fragile dependence of whole nations on a single rider's journey. To study the exceptions is to see the quiet importance of the ordinary. Wars, so frequent in the 17th and 18th centuries, often tore apart postal routes. An invading army might burn bridges, seize stations, or intercept packets to spy on enemies. Riders found themselves carrying not just letters, but secrets worth killing for. During the 30 Years' War, postal networks across Europe were disrupted for years at a time. Couriers rode through war zones, sometimes disguised, sometimes armed. A single intercepted packet could reveal troop movements or secret treaties. Riders who were caught were treated not as neutral messengers but as informants, and some were hanged as spies. Even in less dramatic conflicts, riders struggled. Military requisitions often seized horses, leaving stations empty. Villages burned by marching armies left no safe inns or food. Still, letters were expected to arrive. The rider pressed on, patching together routes across broken lands. The romantic image of highwaymen, masked riders demanding purses, was a grim reality for postal couriers. Letters were rarely the target, but money carried alongside them was tempting. Some packets contained bills of exchange or bonds worth fortunes. A rider who resisted could be shot. One who yielded too quickly might be punished later by his employers. To counter this, some states armed their riders. Pistols, swords, and even escorts were occasionally provided. In England, riders carried the post horn not only as a signal to stations, but as a way to summon help from passing travelers. Still, robberies occurred and stories of missing packets spread uneasily. Every theft reminded the public how thin the line was between order and chaos. Beyond war and robbery, nature itself was the greater enemy. Storms flooded rivers, washing away bridges and drowning horses. Snow buried roads, leaving riders stranded in drifts. Lightning struck open plains where riders had nowhere to hide. Heat in summer baked both man and animal until water was scarce. One letter might take a week in good weather, 2 or 3 in bad. Entire towns sometimes waited anxiously, not knowing whether their letters were delayed, lost, or destroyed. A drowned horse or a fallen rider could erase news of births, deaths, contracts, or treaties. The silence itself became a message. Something had gone wrong. Revolts also threatened the post. Local uprisings often blocked roads, looted stations, or seized letters for political advantage. Rebels knew the value of communication. To cut off posts was to cut off the lifeblood of authority. In some revolutions, such as America's, male riders became heroes. Patriot riders carried secret correspondence, dodging British patrols, sometimes riding through nights without sleep. Here, the dull task of carrying letters suddenly became a dangerous act of resistance. What was once routine transformed into legend. Most of the packets riders carried were routine, taxes, contracts, ordinary family notes. But every so often, a letter mattered. A warning of invasion, a last plea before an execution, a declaration of independence. For the rider, it was just another sealed bundle. Yet history itself sometimes rested in his satchel. We rarely remember their names, but without them, these letters would not have arrived. And when delays or disasters intervened, history bent around their absence. Missed orders meant lost battles. Forgotten warnings meant ruined towns. The rider's monotony was thus paradoxical. His work mattered most when it seemed least remarkable. The disruptions faced by postal riders remind us of the invisible weight they carried. Their rides were boring until they weren't. Their duties seemed small until absence revealed their scale. They lived in a world where silence could mean disaster, and where the humblest horsemen tied together the machinery of states. And so we're left with thought, if so much depended on riders whose names history forgot, how much of our own world today still rests on people doing jobs so ordinary we only notice them when they fail? When we picture the Victorian age, we often imagine carriages, lace dresses, and rich families dining beneath chandeliers. But most Victorians were not wealthy. They were laborers, factory workers, servants, and slum dwellers who lived on the edge of hunger. For them, dinner was not a lavish affair. It was a simple, often meager attempt to quiet the stomach. The table, if they had one, reflected not grandeur but survival. For many poor families, there was no true kitchen. In London's East End or Manchester slums, entire families might rent a single room. Cooking happened over a small coal fire, sometimes shared between several tenants in a common yard. Smoke filled the air, soot-coated walls, and fires were hard to maintain. Fuel itself was costly. Families sometimes collected scraps of wood or dried dung to keep a flame alive. The cooking pot was the most valuable possession. Cast iron, if they were lucky, or battered tin. It held stews, porridge, or whatever scraps could be boiled into something edible. Plates were mismatched, often chipped. Cutlery was scarce. Many ate with spoons, fingers, or hunks of bread used as tools. Bread was a cornerstone of poor Victorian meals. A family might buy a large loaf from the baker each morning, stretching it through the day. White bread was prized or expensive. Cheaper brown bread or adulterated loaves filled with chalk or alum were common. For many, bread with dripping, the fat left from roasting meat, purchased cheaply, was dinner in itself. Children gnawed stale crusts softened in tea or broth. Bread was filling, if not nourishing. Without it, meals fell apart. The cry for bread was not a metaphor. It was the most literal demand of working families. Another staple was porridge, made from oats or barley. In Scotland and northern England, oats were boiled into thick meals that filled stomachs cheaply. Sometimes molasses or treacle was added for sweetness. More often, it was plain and heavy. Potatoes, increasingly available after the 18th century, became another anchor of poor diets. Boiled, mashed, or fried in dripping, they were cheap, filling, and versatile. A sack of potatoes might feed a family for a week, though they offered little variety. The Irish famine of the 1840s revealed the danger of relying too heavily on this single crop. But in England cities, potatoes were often the difference between eating and not. For the poor, meat was not daily fare. Butchers sold scraps, bones with little flesh, offal like liver, heart, or lung, or even pigs' trotters and sheep's heads. These parts were cheap, and they flavored stews. A single bone might be boiled twice, first for broth, then again for soup thickened with oats or barley. Street vendors sold pies filled with mystery meat, often heavily spiced to disguise spoilage. Sausages were notorious for their fillers, bread, fat, and whatever bits of animal could be ground in. For many families, true cuts of beef or pork appeared only on Sundays, if at all. A Sunday roast was less a tradition than a rare luxury. Vegetables played a role, though less than we might imagine. Cabbage, onions, and carrots were common in stews. Turnips and parsnips appeared in rural diets, while city dwellers relied more on whatever could be bought cheaply in markets. Many vegetables were wilted, bruised, or half-rotten, sold to the poor at a fraction of the price. Seasonal rhythms shaped diets heavily. In summer, markets offered beans, peas, and fruit. In winter, diets shrank to root vegetables and bread. Preserving food was difficult without money or space, so meals followed the seasons closely. Water in cities was often unsafe, so many drank weak beer, tea, or milk instead. Beer was cheap, low in alcohol, and safer than river water. Tea, imported from China and India, became the great comfort of the working class. Even weakly brewed, it warmed cold rooms and softened bread crusts. Milk was common but often adulterated with water or chalk. Still, it stretched porridge and gave children some sustenance. For many families, tea with bread and milk was dinner, a meal of liquid and crumbs that filled the evening hours. Dinner in a poor Victorian home was not a feast. It was bread dipped in weak tea, porridge stretched thin, scraps of meat boiled into broth. It was fuel for another day of labor, not a moment of leisure or joy. Yet it kept families alive in cities where survival itself was victory. And so we might ask, when meat was rare and bread was stretched, what strategies did poor families use to make these humble meals last longer? And how did they stretch scraps into something resembling variety? If Section 1 showed us what went on the poor Victorian table, Section 2 shows us the quiet ingenuity that kept those meals from collapsing altogether. Because with food so scarce, survival depended less on what you had than on what you could make of it. Stretching, disguising, and reusing became the hidden arts of the working-class kitchen. The stew pot was a great equalizer of Victorian poverty. Into it went scraps of meat, bones, cabbage leaves, onions, and barley or oats to thicken. A stew could be boiled again and again, with new ingredients added each day. What began as a bone soup on Monday might become a thick porridge by Thursday, each meal carrying the ghost of the last. This was not wasteful, but efficient. Every bit of fat rendered into broth. Every marrow bone boiled twice. Every vegetable peel thrown in for flavor. The stew was not a dish, but a process, a continuous simmer that turned scarcity into sustenance. Bread, always central, was never wasted. Stale loaves were softened with milk, eggs if they could be spared, and sweetened with treacle or raisins when fortune allowed. Baked into bread pudding. Even crumbs became dinner. Poorer households made savory puddings as well. Bread mixed with onions, herbs, or drippings, baked into a heavy loaf that could be sliced and shared. These meals filled stomachs, even if they offered little nourishment. In times of true desperation, bread was boiled into thin gruel, a watery echo of food that nonetheless kept hunger at bay. The poor could rarely afford cuts of beef or pork, but they could buy what wealthier customers rejected. Offal, liver, heart, lung, kidneys was sold cheaply. Boiled, fried, or baked into pies, these parts became central to working-class diets. Sheep's heads were considered a delicacy by some, stripped of every scrap of flesh. Pigs' trotters were boiled into gelatinous broths. These meals were heavy and sometimes unappealing, but they offered protein where little else could. For children raised on offal, the taste became familiar, even comforting, despite its lowly status. Not all meals were cooked at home. Street vendors lined industrial cities, selling pies, sausages, roasted chestnuts, and fried fish. These were cheap, quick meals, bought when families lacked fuel for cooking or when hunger struck outside the home. Yet these foods were risky. Pies often contained spoiled or questionable meat. Sausages were packed with fillers, and fried fish swam in old, reused oil. Still, the cost was low enough to tempt thousands. For many, the street meal was both convenience and gamble. Victorian cooks knew how to make little look like much. A splash of treacle turned porridge into dessert. A spoon of mustard disguised rancid meat. Pepper, when affordable, was used generously to overwhelm dull flavors. Vinegar, the cheapest seasoning, was a household staple. It made boiled greens taste sharper, stretched soups, and even acted as a weak disinfectant. Presentation mattered too. Families often ate from a shared bowl or pot, with the children served first. Hunger was managed by illusion, by eating slowly, by drinking tea between bites, by pretending a thin stew was hearty because it filled a large dish. Nothing was wasted. Bones became soup. Fat was saved for frying. Vegetable peelings went into broths. Cold potatoes became fried cakes the next day. Even tea leaves were sometimes dried and reused, boiled again for a weaker brew. Laundry starch was sometimes thickened with treacle to make a sweet jelly for children. Cheese rinds were boiled into soups. The smallest scraps of bacon were fried with cabbage to give the illusion of a meat dish. This economy of leftovers was not optional. It was the only way to survive. Survival was rarely solitary. Neighbors often exchanged food, lending a bit of bread, sugar, or tea with the promise of repayment. Churches and charities distributed soup or bread tickets in times of crisis. Street kitchens sometimes sold penny dinners, a ladle of soup thickened with barley or rice, offered at cost to the poorest. Even so, shame hung over such charity. Families tried first to stretch their own resources, saving face by making the most of little. The pride of managing one's table, no matter how meager, was as important as the food itself. The poor Victorian dinner was not just about hunger. It was about ingenuity. Families bent scraps into meals disguise flaws, share with neighbors, and boil bones until nothing remained. What looks to us like desperation was to them ordinary skill, handed down in kitchens thick with steam and smoke. And yet, we are left with the question, when families live so close to hunger, what happened when work failed entirely, when wages vanished, bread prices rose, and even scraps became out of reach? For the poor in Victorian Britain, dinner was always fragile. A lost day's wages, a strike, or the rise of bread prices could tip a family from thin survival into outright hunger. When scraps and ingenuity ran out, meals became shadows of themselves, symbols of endurance rather than nourishment. This final chapter of the Victorian dinner is not about food, but about what happened when food was missing. Bread prices rose and fell with harvests, wars, and tariffs. A bad year for wheat could double the price of loaves, cutting straight into family survival. When bread cost too much, entire meals collapsed. Families bought smaller loaves, mixed with more water, and stretched them across too many mouths. The famous cry of the working poor was not for delicacies, but for cheap bread. Riots broke out when prices soared. In towns and cities, bakers' shops were attacked, their loaves seized and distributed by desperate crowds. The hunger was not abstract. It was a direct result of bread disappearing from tables. What did dinner look like when there was nothing? Often it was tea, weak, bitter, and stretched across the family. Children soaked crusts in it and chewed them slowly. Adults drank it hot to quiet their stomachs. Sometimes it was water flavored with a single bone, boiled until the broth was gray. Some families ate nothing but potatoes for weeks, morning and evening. Others relied on porridge, so thin it was nearly water. The language of the poor reflected this emptiness. Tea dinners, potato dinners, bread suppers. Each phrase meant not a full meal, but a survival tactic. Charities, churches, and reformers tried to fill the gap. Soup kitchens ladled out thin broth, thickened with rice or barley. Workhouses provided meals of gruel, oatmeal and water, sometimes flavored with salt. For the destitute, this was both salvation and humiliation. A penny dinner offered by some missions became a lifeline. For 1 penny, a child could eat bread and soup, sometimes with a scrap of meat. These kitchens often smelled of boiled cabbage and cheap spices, feeding hundreds at once. Yet the experience was mechanical, more about calories and dignity. The workhouse, dreaded above all, reduced meals to bare subsistence. Families who entered were divided, men, women, and children separated, and fed identically thin gruel or bread with dripping. The cruelty was deliberate. Charity was meant to deter as much as to help. Hunger left its mark. Children grew stunted, their ribs showing through thin shirts. Women weakened first, often giving their share to husbands and children, carrying hunger in pale faces and hollow eyes. Men, exhausted from labor without fuel, fainted at work. Doctors in poor districts described the hungry look as unmistakable. Dinner, in such cases, was not only inadequate, it was a reminder of inequality. Families knew that only streets away, wealthier households dined on roast puddings and wine. The contrast sharpened every bite of stale bread. Even in hunger, people improvised. Families boiled nettles, dandelion leaves, or cabbage stalks as substitute greens. Children were sent to scavenge for coal and food scraps, picking from refuse piles behind markets. In rural areas, foraging added mushrooms, berries, or hedgerow fruit. Street sellers catered to desperation, too, offering penny pies with fillings so questionable they were mocked in newspapers. These pies, greasy and mysterious, were still meals. For the poorest, survival meant swallowing doubt along with dinner. Dinner in a poor Victorian home carried emotional weight far beyond the food itself. To provide even a crust was to preserve family dignity. To fail was to admit defeat. Mothers wept over empty pots. Fathers pawned tools to buy bread. Children cried themselves to sleep with bellies aching. Hunger was not just a physical condition. It was humiliation, a public exposure of poverty that could not be hidden when families sat around the table with nothing to eat. The Victorian dinner of the poor was more often an absence than a presence. It was tea instead of stew, crust instead of loaves, gruel instead of meat. Yet in its thinness, it revealed the resilience of families who stretched, improvised, and endured. Dinner was not pleasure, it was survival. And so we are left with sobering thought. If the measure of society can be seen in how its poorest families eat, what does a Victorian table reveal about an empire that was rich in industry, yet left millions to dine on little more than bread and tea? Medieval life was marked by toil, plowing, sowing, reaping, and serving. Yet beyond the field and the hearth, another quiet labor defined society: the counting of taxes. Unlike the clang of swords or the pomp of coronations, this work was not dramatic. It was repetitive, meticulous, and dull, but it shaped kingdoms as surely as wars. For peasants and lords alike, the endless arithmetic of tribute was inescapable. In the Middle Ages, tax was not a single word but a web of obligations. There were tithes to the church, rents to the Lord, levies to the king, tolls for markets, and dues for bridges or mills. Each one required calculation. Each one required recording, and each one required payment in goods or coin. For peasants, this meant parting with a share of harvest or livestock, a tenth of grain, a set number of eggs, a portion of wool. These payments passed upward. For merchants, it meant tolls on roads, fees of ports, or duties on trade. For knights and lords, it meant contributing to armies or paying scutage, money in place of military service. Each layer required counting, and counting meant clerks with ink-stained fingers tallying goods late into the night. Most medieval taxes were not paid in coins but in kind. A farmer might haul sacks of barley to a granary, or deliver sheep to a manor's flock. Each delivery had to be measured, weighed, and noted. Clerks marked tallies on wooden sticks, each notch representing a portion owed. These tallies were split. The lord kept one half, the peasant another, so disputes could be checked later. The monotony was immense. Grain was poured, weighed, recorded. Sheep were driven, counted, branded. Eggs were stacked, butter weighed, honey measured. Each transaction meant arguments. A peasant insisting the measure was short, a clerk declaring it full. The work was tedious, but it was a slow pulse of the medieval economy. Behind the collectors stood clerks. Their job was to write all down, rolls of parchment filled with names, sums, and notes on payments. Latin phrases marched across lines. So-and-so owes this much wheat, this tenant pays in hens, this miller delivers flour. The famous Doomsday Book of 1086 was a monument to this process, an immense survey of land, people, and obligations. But behind its neat Latin entries lay years of dull work. Clerks trudged from village to village, asking the same questions, recording the same facts, until every field and ox was counted. Most records did not survive, but countless rolls and fragments remind us of the endless tide of ink that kept kingdoms solvent. For the peasant, tax day was heavy. Harvest already meant hard labor, and giving away part of it was salt in the wound. Some families scraped together just enough to meet dues, then faced winter with little left. Complaints and petitions survive in records. Pleas for relief after bad harvests, desperate requests to delay payment, yet few escaped entirely. Lords and bailiffs enforced collections, sometimes harshly. Livestock could be seized, tools taken, or land reclaimed. Taxes were not abstract. They were visible in the barns emptied and the children going hungry. What made medieval taxation truly boring history was not its cruelty, but its constancy. Year after year, season after season, the same counts repeated. A tenth of wheat, a share of wool, a levy for war, a toll to bridge. Collectors trudged through mud. Clerks dipped quills. Peasants measured sacks. The rhythm of counting became part of life itself. Taxes built castles, funded armies, and filled monasteries. But for those who lived under them, they were less about power than about monotony. Endless counting defined the relationship between ruler and ruled. And so we might ask, how did medieval rulers keep this machine of counting going? And what structures of officials and bureaucracies made such endless tallies possible? If taxation was the burden of peasants, it was a profession of officials. Behind every notch on a tally stick stood a network of scribes, bailiffs, sheriffs, and royal officers. Their lives were not dramatic but clerical, built on ink, rolls of parchment, and unending repetition. The strength of medieval states lay not in shining swords, but in men with quills. At the manor level, taxes were managed by the bailiff, the lord's chief officer. He supervised harvest collections, kept records of tenants, and ensured deliveries to the granary or storehouse. Below him, The reeve, often a peasant elected or compelled from the community, kept watch on his neighbors, making sure everyone gave what was due. The reeve's position was thankless. He was caught between loyalty to his fellows and duty to his lord. Too lenient, and he risked dismissal. Too strict, and he earned resentment. Yet without reeves and bailiffs, the entire system faltered. Above the manor, the sheriff represented the king's will. In England, sheriffs were responsible for collecting royal taxes within a shire. They summoned juries, managed courts, and delivered revenues to crown. For this, they became both feared and despised. Sheriffs were often accused of corruption, inflating sums, or pocketing fees. Chroniclers railed against their greed, yet the crown relied on them. Without sheriffs, royal treasuries dried up. They were the visible arm of royal taxation, riding through towns with armed men, demanding payment. But the true soul of taxation lay in the clerks. These men sat at long tables, scratching ink into rolls of parchment. They produced the pipe rolls in England, annual records of payments due and received, stretching back to the 12th century. Each roll was a monument to monotony, filled with columns of figures, names, and places. Clerks were trained in Latin and arithmetic. Their handwriting had to be steady, their patience unending. The same phrases repeated line after line. So-and-so owes this much in scutage. So-and-so delivers this many hides of land. Mistakes meant disputes, and disputes meant loss of revenue. Accuracy mattered more than speed. For the modern reader, these rolls are dry. For medieval rulers, they were lifelines, evidence that money and goods had been properly extracted from the realm. At the highest level stood the exchequer. In England, this royal office became the central accounting system by the 12th century. Officials gathered around a checkered cloth table, hence the name, where counters were moved across squares to calculate sums. Each sheriff appeared before the exchequer yearly, presenting tallies and rolls to prove what he had collected. This process was slow, formal, and ritualistic. Sheriffs swore oaths. Clerks compared tallies, and disputes were argued in courtly Latin. The system was both tedious and intimidating, designed to make evasion difficult. Year after year, the exchequer repeated the same rituals, binding the kingdom together through numbers. The machinery of taxation ran on fear as much as duty. Bailiffs who failed to collect could be dismissed. Sheriffs who withheld funds could be imprisoned. Even clerks risked punishment for fraud. Records mention officials fined for negligence, their land seized until payments were settled. The dull repetition of counting was backed by sharp consequences. Every notch and figure was more than arithmetic. It was accountability. The kingdom's stability depended on these ledgers being believed. This bureaucracy gave rulers more than money. It gave them reach. Through taxes, kings touched every village, every farm, every merchant on the road. Clerks knew names, tallies, and debts. Sheriffs enforced them with muscle. What might seem like dry record-keeping was, in truth, the essence of medieval government. Even great wars depended on this boring machinery. A king who dreamed of conquest could only act if his clerks had already inked the sums, his sheriffs collected the dues, and his reeves pressed peasants for grain. Behind every banner raised in battle lay years of ledgers and tallies. The machinery of taxation shows us that medieval states were not only forged on battlefields, but at counting tables. The rhythm of quills, the scratching of tallies, the footsteps of sheriffs, all these dull sounds kept kingdoms alive. And so we are left to wonder, what happened when this machinery failed? When collectors overreached, when peasants resisted, and when the monotony of counting boiled into open revolt? For centuries, medieval taxes were endured with grumbling. Peasants cursed, merchants complained, clerks cheated, but the machine kept rolling. Yet every so often, the monotony cracked. When harvests failed, when collectors pressed too hard, or when rulers demanded more than people could give, resentment boiled over. The endless arithmetic of tribute, so dull in daily life, suddenly became the spark of rebellion. The medieval tax burden was heavy even in ordinary years. A tenth to the church, a due to the Lord, a levy for the king, each claim carved into a family survival. But during wars, rulers demanded more. Armies had to be fed, castles repaired, crusades financed. Special taxes called aid, subsidies, or tallies piled on top of ordinary dues. Merchants, too, suffered. Tolls and customs multiplied as kings sought revenue. To cross a river, a bridge, or a city gate meant handing over coins. A trader might pay so many duties on a single journey that profit vanished. These were not dramatic oppressions, but daily irritations. Pennies taken here, shillings there, until resentment grew. Not all revolt was open. Often it began with evasion. Peasants had grain, sold livestock in secret or underreported land. Clerks complained of concealments, entire villages swearing falsely about their yields. Collectors sometimes faced silence when they came to demand payment. Doors shut, barns empty, promises made to pay after harvest that never came. Sometimes resistance turned violent. A bailiff might be beaten, a sheriff's men stoned in the road. In records, such incidents are described as disturbances or a phrase, but behind those words was desperation. For people who lived on the edge, even one more sack of grain taken could mean starvation. Some resistances grew into full-scale uprisings. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England was sparked by the hated poll tax, a flat rate demanded from every adult regardless of wealth. The idea of taxing even the poorest labor enraged communities. Villagers marched on London, burned records, and executed tax collectors. For a brief moment, the endless counting was overturned by fire and fury. In Flanders, towns rose against heavy dues imposed to fund wars. Weavers and merchants alike resisted, their revolt fueled by both hunger and pride. Across Europe, countless local risings, often forgotten, sprang up when collectors overreached. Small villages refused entry to sheriffs, manors chased out bailiffs, towns barricaded gates. The pattern repeated. Too much counting led to too much resentment. Fueling these revolts was not just poverty, but corruption. Tax officials skimmed from collections, inflating demands to enrich themselves. Peasants rarely saw justice. To them, every collector was a thief in the Lord's clothing. Even when rulers reformed systems, trust was slow to return. Chroniclers record bitter complaints that sheriffs demanded more than owed, that clerks invented debts, that reeves protected favorites. Whether entirely true or not, perception mattered. The machinery of counting, once mistrusted, became a symbol of oppression rather than order. Revolt, however, was dangerous. Kings responded harshly. After the Peasants' Revolt, leaders were executed, villages fined, and laws tightened. Resistance often ended with greater burdens than before. Yet the memory lingered. Each rebellion, even when crushed, reminded rulers that taxation had limits. Over time, parliaments and assemblies emerged partly as a response to this tension. Kings learned they could not demand endlessly without consent. The dull arithmetic of taxes thus shaped not only daily life, but the very institutions of governance. The endless counting of medieval taxes was more than clerks and ledgers. It was the invisible weight under which millions lived. Most of the time, people endured it with weary patience. But when the balance tipped, the monotony turned to fury and the kingdom trembled. And so we're left to wonder, if something as dull as counting grain and tallying coins could topple villages and shake kings, what other boring routines of history carry hidden power we rarely notice until they break? Laundry is one of those chores, so ordinary we barely think about it today. A machine hums detergent foams, and we move on. But for most of history, washing clothes was not simple. It was long, backbreaking, and often done without soap as we know it. Before chemical detergents, before modern bars, people turned to water, ash, lye, and sheer muscle. The story of laundry is a story of survival through dirt. Clothes in pre-modern societies dirted quickly. Roads were muddy, homes smoky, fields dusty, and bodies rarely bathed. Wool soaked in smells, linen turned gray, and grease from cooking clung stubbornly. Washing was not optional, it was necessity, yet it was also dreaded. Women described wash days as the hardest labor of the household calendar. Unlike cooking or mending, laundry was not daily but cyclical. Families might wash clothes weekly, fortnightly, or even monthly, piling up soiled garments until the day came. That day was dreaded because it meant lifting, soaking, boiling, beating, wringing, and drying, often from dawn to dusk. The most basic method of washing was at the riverbank. Women carried baskets of clothes. knelt at the water's edge, and beat garments against stones or wooden boards. The rushing water carried away dirt, but the process was brutal on fabric and body alike. Winter made it worse. Hands plunged into icy streams until fingers were raw and numb. In some villages, communal washhouses or lavoirs were built, roof structures where women gathered around stone basins. These offered shelter from rain and gave laundry a social dimension. Gossip, songs, and stories passed as hands scrubbed. Yet the labor remained heavy, and the water, reused again and again, grew murky by day's end. Without soap, the main cleanser was ash. Wood ash from hearths was collected, sifted, and mixed with water. This produced lye, a caustic liquid that broke down grease and stains. Clothes were soaked in it, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. The smell was sharp, the texture harsh, but it worked. In rural homes, ash lye was poured through wooden tubs packed with laundry, seeping downward to strip dirt. In cities, washerwomen sometimes boiled clothes and lie over great cauldrons. The process whitened linens but wore them out quickly. Hands, too, suffered. Skin cracked, nails burned, eyes stung from the fumes. Mechanical action was as important as chemicals. Clothes were not gently swirled. They were attacked. Wooden paddles, called beetles or bats, struck wet cloth to loosen dirt. Garments were rubbed against washboards, scraped with brushes, or trodden underfoot. Every movement was muscle against fabric. This constant beating shortened the life of clothes, but most families had little choice. Linen shirts, shifts, and sheets were valuable, handed down, patched, and repurposed. Washing was as much about preserving them as about cleaning them. Too little care and they rotted. Too much force and they tore. The balance was precarious. Wash day filled homes and streets with its own atmosphere. Cauldrons of lye boiled, steam rose, and wet wool or linen hung from lines. The smell was pungent. Ash, smoke, damp cloth, and human effort. Villages often knew when wash day came because lines of clothing appeared everywhere, fluttering like banners of survival. Children remember the sound of it, the thud of paddles, the hiss of boiling, the murmur of women bent over basins. It was not glamorous, but it was unforgettable. Laundry before soap was not about convenience, but about sheer endurance. It was water fetched, ash boiled, cloth beaten, and hands left raw. Yet it kept families clothed and households respectable. Clean linen, even gray and frayed, marked dignity in a world where dirt was constant. And so we are left to wonder, what other methods and tricks, beyond lye and beating, did people develop to manage stains, odors, and endless piles of clothing in the centuries before modern detergents? If wash day was misery, it was also ingenuity. Families didn't just soak cloth in ash and hope for the best. They developed tricks, little rituals and remedies, to stretch fabrics, mask odors, and fight stains that seem impossible to remove. Laundry before soap was not only about strength, but also about craft. Stains were common and stubborn. Grease from cooking fires, wine from taverns, blood from accidents, and mud from fields all clung to fabric. Without modern bleach or detergents, households turned to simple chemistry. Urine, surprisingly common, stale urine called chamber lye, was collected, fermented, and used as a powerful cleanser. Its ammonia content lifted grease and whitened linen. Fullers, professionals who treated cloth, used vats of it for centuries. The smell was harsh, but the results were real. Vinegar and whey, acids cut through stains, especially on linen. Buttermilk and sour whey were rubbed into spots before washing. Salt and ash paste. For blood or wine, mixtures of ash and salt were smeared, then scrubbed away. Sunlight, perhaps the oldest trick of all. Stained cloth was spread in fields or courtyards to bleach naturally under the sun. Repeated wetting and drying slowly whitened even stubborn marks. Each household carried a small arsenal of such remedies, passed from mothers to daughters, whispered between washerwomen at riversides. Cleanliness did not always mean odor-free. Even freshly washed clothes could smell of smoke, lye, or dampness. To mask this, people used herbs and perfumes. Lavender, rosemary, and thyme were tucked into linen chests. Rose water was sprinkled onto cloth before wearing. Wealthier households imported musk or ambergris, rubbing a drop onto collars or cuffs. For most, though, herbs were the cheapest solution. Fields of lavender in Provence or rosemary in English gardens supplied households with the simple means to make laundry smell a little fresher. Bundles of herbs were burned with the wash water, releasing fragrance into steam. In some regions, especially low countries, laundry went beyond the yard. Bleaching fields, large open spaces of grass, were used to whiten linen. After washing, cloth was laid out in long strips, sprinkled with water, and left under sun and dew. Over weeks, repeated exposure bleached the fibers, producing the bright white linen prized in markets. This was slow, communal work. Entire fields shimmered with cloth, watched carefully to prevent theft. The process could last months, but it gave households linens that glowed against otherwise dull wardrobes. To own white linen was a mark of respectability, and bleaching was as much social display as hygiene. Not every family could or wanted to do the labor themselves. In towns and cities, washerwomen offered services for a fee. They collected laundry, soaked it in cauldrons, beat it by rivers, and returned it, hopefully, fresher. These women were often poor, widowed, or supporting children, their backs bent from endless labor. Their reputation was mixed. Some praised them as saviors of households. Others mocked them as gossips who traded secrets along with laundry. Plays and songs often cast washerwomen as comic figures, their arms strong, their tongues sharper. Yet behind the stereotype was grueling, thankless work that kept cities from drowning in filth. In many places, laundry was not solitary but communal. Washhouses became gathering spots where women shared stories, songs, and complaints. The drudgery was softened by conversation. In some regions, special songs were sung to set rhythm to beating clothes, echoing like work chants across stone basins. Children sometimes tagged along, splashing in water or carrying baskets. Laundry thus became part community rhythm, not only work, but social glue. What seems boring today was, for them, a moment of shared endurance. Once clean, laundry faced new challenges. Damp cloth left in piles grew moldy. In cold or wet climates, dry was constant struggle. Families stretched ropes across courtyards or hung clothes in attics, where smoke from hearths helped dry and preserve them. In winter, shirts might freeze stiff on lines before thawing by fire. To keep clothing fresh once dried, people store it with herbs, cedar chips, or simple cloth covers. Chests lined with linen kept out moths. Families too poor for such luxuries often simply folded garments and prayed dampness did not creep back in. Laundry before soap was not just a task, but a culture of small tricks and shared wisdom. Every stain had its folk cure, every odor its herbal mask, every damp winter its workaround. The process destroyed hands, shortened the life of clothes, and consumed entire days. Yet it also revealed resilience. And so we might ask, what happened when soap finally did become common? How did it change the rhythm of laundry? And what new burdens or freedoms did it bring to households? For centuries, laundry meant water, ash, and aching arms. But little by little, soap crept into households, reshaping the rhythm of wash day. At first it was rare, expensive, and patchy in quality. Eventually, it became ordinary. This quiet revolution, boring in its routine, profound in its impact, transformed the way families thought about dirt, cleanliness, and respectability. Soap was not new in the Middle Ages. Recipes existed. Animal fat mixed with ash to form a crude block, but it was harsh, greasy, and not widely available. Some regions, like Castile in Spain, became famous for better soap made with olive oil. Still, for most people, soap was a luxury. A small bar might be saved for washing hands or linen, not for everyday clothing. In many rural homes, soap making was seasonal. When animals were slaughtered, leftover fat was boiled with lye to make household bars. The results varied, sometimes hard, sometimes crumbly, sometimes so caustic they burned skin. Soap was useful but unpredictable, never quite replacing lye and urine as the main cleansers. By the 17th and 18th centuries, soap began to spread in European cities. Guilds of soap makers produced it in larger batches, often taxed heavily by states eager for revenue. The cost remained high, but the presence of soap shops in towns signaled change. Urban households with means could now buy regular supplies. For the poor, soap was still precious. Families rationed it carefully, cutting small shavings to dissolve in water. Some reserved soap for collars, cuffs, and linens, visible garments that carried social judgment. A shirt washed with soap marked not only cleanliness but respectability. The true shift came in the 19th century with industrialization. Advances in chemistry, especially the work of French chemist Nicolas Leblanc in the late 18th century, made soda ash, a key ingredient, cheaper and more available. Soap production scaled up, prices fell, and suddenly it was no longer a luxury. By mid-Victorian times, companies like Lever Brothers, later Unilever, turned soap into a household staple. Advertisements declared cleanliness a moral duty. Posters showed mothers scrubbing with smiling children, connecting soap with virtue as much as hygiene. What had been backbreaking drudgery now carried an aura of progress. With soap, wash day changed. Clothes still required soaking, boiling, and scrubbing, but stains lifted faster, odors cleared more easily, and fabrics lasted longer. Linen came out brighter, wool less greasy. Soap reduced the need for stale urine or harsh lye, sparing both cloth and hands. Yet the burden did not disappear. Laundry was still labor-intensive well into the 19th century. Women still bent over tubs, still beat cloth against boards, still spent whole days on the task. But soap shortened the hours and slowly shifted the cultural meaning of clean. To have soap-washed laundry was to signal decency, order, and pride. The spread of soap also sharpened class lines. Those who could afford frequent soap washing displayed bright linens and fresh-smelling clothes. The poor, still rationing, carried the stigma of dingy garments. Reformers and inspectors noted these differences, equating cleanliness with morality. In workhouses and schools, soap was distributed alongside discipline, part shaping respectable citizens. Soap became not only a tool but a symbol, a bar of respectability in every wash basin. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, soap making reached industrial heights. Factories produced bars by the ton, shipping them worldwide. The invention of synthetic detergents in the early 20th century went even further, introducing powders that worked in hard water and colder washes. Laundry, once defined by lye and rivers, now hummed with machines and foamed with powders. The revolution was slow, boring, and domestic, but it changed the rhythm of life more profoundly than many wars. The coming of soap turned laundry from a brutal battle with dirt into a manageable routine. It freed hours, preserved fabric, and redefined cleanliness as a cultural expectation. What had once been endured became an emblem of respectability. And so we're left with the thought, if something as ordinary as laundry could quietly reshape society, how many other boring chores have shaped history in ways we've yet to notice? For much of history, the world after sunset was dark. Darkness shaped human life, slowing labor, deepening silence, and bringing fears to surface. The candle was one of the few weapons against that darkness. Yet behind every flicker of light was the work of candle makers, craftsmen and laborers whose lives were marked not by brilliance but by monotony. Their trade was dull, smelly, and repetitive. Still, it was essential. Before gas lamps, before electricity, most homes depended on candles for evening light. Wealthier households used beeswax candles, which burned brightly, evenly, and with a sweet scent. Poorer families relied on tallow candles, cheaper, smokier, and foul-smelling. For peasants, even tallow was a luxury. Many depended on rushlights, reeds dipped in fat, which guttered quickly. But in towns and cities, candles were constant. They lit churches, guild halls, inns, courts, and homes. To be a candle maker was not glamorous, but it guaranteed steady demand. Every nightfall renewed the need. Most candles were made from tallow, rendered from animal fat. Butchers sold scraps of suet to chandlers, candle makers, who boiled it down in large cauldrons. The process was filthy. The fat smoked, bubbled, and released a stench that clung to clothes and skin. Entire streets where chandlers worked were infamous for their odor. Once rendered, the liquid tallow was poured into molds or used for dipping. Wicks, strand of flax, hemp, or cotton, were dipped repeatedly, each layer cooling before another was added. It was slow, repetitive work. Dip, cool, dip again. By day's end, racks of pale candles stood drying, ready for sale. By contrast, beeswax candles were prized. They burned longer, dripped less, and filled the air with a faint honeyed scent. But beeswax was costly. Collecting it meant maintaining hives, scraping combs, and filtering impurities. Monasteries, with their access to bees, often controlled wax supplies, reserving them for altars and great halls. For candle makers, working with wax was cleaner than with tallow, but also more restricted. The church consumed vast quantities, creating steady but controlled markets. Secular buyers had to pay dearly, making wax a symbol of wealth as much as light. The candle maker's life was rhythm more than creativity. Days began with rendering fat, cutting wicks, or melting wax. Hours passed in dipping and molding. Finished candles were trimmed, packed, and sold in bundles. The work rarely changed, season after season. Apprenticeships lasted years, teaching boys how to handle boiling tallow, cut proper wicks, and avoid fires in workshops filled with fat and flame. Masters oversaw production, sometimes running shops attached to their homes. Families lived with the smell of their trade, the stink of tallow clinging even to their meals. Candles were not only household goods, they were measures of time and wealth. Monasteries recorded candle usage in their accounts, each inch burned marking hours of prayer. Guilds regulated prices and production, ensuring quality and preventing fraud. Some cities taxed candles directly, making them part of civic revenue. In poor homes, the number of candles burned each night revealed fortune. To use more than one was a luxury. To save stubs and melt them into new lights was common practice. Every candle was a calculation. How long to work, how long to read, how long to sit in conversation before surrendering to darkness. The life of a candle maker was silent, repetitive, and pungent. Yet without their labor, towns would have stumbled blindly after sunset, churches gone unlit, and households sunk into gloom. Candles, boring in their sameness, were threads holding together the fabric of medieval and early modern nights. And so, we might ask, what social and cultural structures grew around candles, guilds, rituals, and nightly rhythms that tied light itself to labor chandlers? If Section 1 showed the candle maker at work, Section 2 shows the invisible web around him. Guild charters, church rituals, civic regulations, and the rhythms of society itself. The candle was not just wax and wick. It was law, status, and ritual, all counted and controlled in dull but powerful ways. By the later Middle Ages, many European towns had candle makers' guilds, often called chandlers' guilds. These organizations regulated who could produce candles, how they were made, and how they were sold. Apprenticeship was strict. Boys entered as teenagers, trained for years, and only after proving their skill could they set up as masters. Guilds inspected quality. Candles too thin or poorly dipped were fined. Some chandlers tried to cheat by mixing cheaper fats into wax or stretching tallow with water. Guild officials tested goods, ensuring buyers received consistent products. This regulation gave chandlers status. They were craftsmen, not just sellers of fat. But guild life was also restrictive. Production quotas limited competition, and fees for membership were steep. For some families, the guild was protection. For others, it was a barrier. Still, it tied candle making into the civic fabric, ensuring that light itself became a regulated commodity. Nowhere was a demand for candles greater than in the church. Every mass, every vigil, every feast required them. Altars glowed with beeswax tapers, symbolizing purity. Holy days consumed vast stores of wax, sometimes bankrupting parishes that could not afford enough. Candle makers benefited, but also lived under church scrutiny. Monasteries often made their own wax candles, but parish churches depended on local chandlers. Some even kept accounts showing exact numbers. So many pounds of wax for Easter, so many for Christmas, so many for the daily offices. The symbolism of light, Christ as illumination, darkness as sin, gave candles a sacred role. For chandlers, this meant steady business, but also dependence on an institution that demanded perfection and low prices. Cities, too, regulated candles, seeing them as vital for order. Street lighting in medieval towns was rare, but courts, guild halls, and council chambers required steady supplies. Some cities imposed candle taxes. Others restricted sales to licensed shops. During fairs and festivals, regulations were strict. Stalls had to be lit by safe, approved candles to reduce fire risk. Markets inspected stalls for quality. In some towns, only candles of certain size or wick thickness could be sold in public spaces. This regulation was dull paperwork for officials, but shaped the rhythm of life. Candles were everywhere, yet always counted, taxed, and inspected. In private homes, candles structured evenings. One candle for supper, one for reading, one for sewing. Families measured their nights by inches of wax. To extinguish a candle early was to save money. To burn one long into the night was indulgence. In poorer homes, candles were guarded carefully. Children were scolded for letting them gutter. Stubs were saved, remelted, and molded again. Families without candles turned to rushlights, dried reeds dipped in fat that burned only minutes at a time. These too required tending, snuffed and relit endlessly. The candle thus dictated time itself. Without it, evening was short. With it, hours stretched, but at a cost. Candles revealed class distinctions as clearly as clothes. Beeswax in a home signaled wealth. The rich dined by multiple tapers, their tables glowing with steady, sweet-smelling light. The poor struggled with smoky tallow, coughing in its haze. Travelers noted the difference instantly. One house gleamed, another barely glowed. Even among the poor, how many candles one could afford marked status. To burn more than one at a time was extravagance. Some families lit a single candle and gathered all tasks around it. Children reading, women sewing, men mending tools. The light was shared, and so was its symbolism. Survival together in the dim. The culture of candles reveals how something boring and repetitive shaped medieval life. Guilds gave structure. Churches demanded ritual. Cities enforced rules, and households counted minutes by inches of wax. To light a candle was never just to chase away darkness. It was to participate in a system of labor, regulation, and symbolism. And so we are left to wonder, what happened when this world of wax and tallow was disrupted? When new forms of light, from oil lamps to gas and electricity, slowly extinguished the candle maker's silent trade? For centuries, the chandler's life was steady. Tallow boiled, wax melted, wicks dipped, candles bundled. Demand never ended because darkness never changed. Yet the 18th and 19th centuries brought a transformation that extinguished the candle maker's dominance. New fuels, new lamps, and eventually new technologies replaced the dull but vital rhythm of dipping and molding. The silent life of the chandler grew quieter still until it disappeared. The first challenge came from oil lamps. Whale oil, particularly sperm oil, burned brighter and cleaner than tallow. In coastal cities, where whaling flourished, oil lamps spread through homes and streets. Their glow was steadier, their smell less offensive. Chandlers adapted by selling lamp oil alongside candles, but already the monopoly of wax and tallow was weakening. The whaling industry grew vast, stretching from New England to the Pacific. Barrels of oil lit cities, fueled lamps, and created a new rhythm of light. Candle makers, once central to every town, found themselves competing with a global trade. The true disruption began with gaslight in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Pipes carried coal gas into lamps along city streets, into theaters, and into wealthy homes. For the first time, light was abundant, centralized, and not tied to wicks and wax. Gaslight transformed urban nights. Streets glowed, factories worked longer hours. Theaters sparkled with brightness no candle could match. For chandlers, the shift was devastating. City contracts once reserved for candles now went to gas companies. The humble taper, once essential, became old-fashioned. By the late 19th century, electricity delivered the final blow. Electric bulbs required no fat, no wax, no wick. They glowed longer, cleaner, and safer. What had been ritual, cutting wicks, saving stubs, rationing inches of wax, vanished overnight. Light became abundant, no longer tied to smell, labor, or fire risk. Candle making did not vanish instantly. Rural areas still relied on tallow well into the 19th century. Poor families still molded rushlights and stubs. But the tide was irreversible. Electric lamps spread, and the candle receded into symbolism. Some chandlers adapted, turning from necessity to luxury. Beeswax candles remained in churches, their symbolism irreplaceable. Others shifted to scented candles for wealthy households, marketing fragrance rather than light. Over time, candle making became less an occupation and more a craft, something artisanal, decorative, or ritual. By the 20th century, chandlers no longer carried the weight of society's nights. Their trade, once boring but essential, became quaint. What remained was memory. Literature and diaries still spoke of candle hours, of children gathered around a single flame, of scholars writing by taper. Candles lived on in rituals, on altars and vigils, in ceremonies of life and death. They became symbols of memory rather than tools of survival. Yet the lives of the candle makers themselves faded. Their names rarely recorded, their workshops demolished, their craft remembered only in passing. History often praises the inventors of electricity, but forgets the centuries of silent chandlers who kept nights alive.